Robert Gamble. I'm an artist and I live in Surrey, in Walton-on-Thames. I was taught about painting by a really good artist in the West Country called Robert Lenkovich, and he's been a big influence on me. He was a major influence on me. He was a painter of people, and he painted on sociological themes, on death, on old age, on mental and physical handicap, on vagrancy, on sexual behaviour, and he was almost like a sociologist. I've got a tattoo of him here on my arm. Well, Vincent Van Gogh inspires me because he was mentally ill, and he thought he was a failure. And by the time he was dying on his deathbed, he thought he had failed in his artistic career, and he thought he had failed at being a preacher because he was a Christian, and he preached the word of God in the London area, I think in Richmond and places like that. I forget now. But when he died, he thought he had failed in his pursuit. But now, of course, we have the Van Gogh Museum, and he's one of the most instantly recognisable and famous artists who ever lived. Well, lately I've started experimenting in expressionism and painting with really bright colours, straight from the tube, not really mixing them with other colours. But in the past I've painted lots of portraits and figures and still lifes and landscapes. But I've settled into these bright, colourful, childish paintings now because they're a lot more fun than what I was doing. I paint people mainly that I know, or if I hear about them, and if I hear they have an interesting background, I want to kind of tell that story. Well, I met her a few years ago in an exhibition, and in the Riverhouse Art Centre in Walton-on-Thames, where I used to work, and I found her intriguing because she had a tattoo, or has a tattoo, of Mother Teresa on her arm. And when I asked her about that, she said that she was brought up in an orphanage in Calcutta by Mother Teresa, and she was born with a cleft lip and palate. And Mother Teresa was actually the person who got the operation started to sort it out, and she's had about 25 operations on her upper lip, and you can hardly see anything now. This is my friend Matthew Smith, or Matt Smith. He goes by the name of Matt R. Druid, and he's an outsider artist, so he's never had any formal training. But he produces really good artworks, very good painter. He is a druid by his religion, and he paints a lot of stuff related to that. This is actually a Kelpie. I'm not entirely sure what a Kelpie is, but I remember him saying it's a Kelpie. And he's pretty much unheard of, like me. He doesn't show his artwork very often, and it's a real shame because he's a very skilled, very good painter, and he's a very interesting chap too. The first one I did of Maggie, we were talking all the time, and she was moving a lot, so it wasn't a decent painting, so I got her back a second time, and I did a smaller painting of her just staring straight at me, and we were still, and I got a decent painting done then. It's part of my interest in recording the people and places around me. It's part of my interest of showing what it was to be alive at this time. My belief in God is mostly separate from my paintings. I've only painted a few images that relate to it. I've only painted some people that I met from church. It's mainly my prayers when I'm painting are mainly to stay focused and stay calm and produce a successful image. Now I'm working in a different style from that I ever painted in. I'm technically a beginner again. I'm technically painting in this expressionistic way, which I've got no real experience in. So I'm hoping that it works out from piece to piece. I hope that when I'm doing it, I don't mess it up and I don't waste the canvas. That has happened in the past. And when paintings go wrong, it's a waste of materials, it's a waste of canvas, it's a waste of paint, it's a waste of time. And so when I pray when I'm painting, I hope that each painting will be a success. It's a long story how I came to God, but I feel it's an interesting one. I basically, 26 years ago, I had a brother called Peter, and he died in a car accident when he was 18. And as he died, about 5 miles away he was, but as he died, I felt him die, and I felt his spirit come through the bedroom windows. We shared a bedroom in those days when we were young, and I felt his spirit come through the windows, and I felt it with such a force, it knocked me off my seat, and it sent me back into the stereo behind me. And I looked at the clock on the stereo, and it said 13 minutes past 7, and I really tried to convince myself I hadn't just felt him die. So I sat back down in front of my computer and played my game, and sometime later on, a car drew up outside the window, and I knew before I looked at it, it was a police traffic car. And so I peeked through the curtains, and it was a police traffic car, and I knew that he had died. And then they came down my driveway and they spoke to my mother, and they told her that he had died. Some years later on, I was very depressed, I was very miserable and contemplating suicide. And I started to see him. And the first sighting was in Dowsland, where I grew up, in a little forest. But I remember walking along, and I felt his presence behind me, and I turned around, and he was there. He was standing about 50 feet away, looking at me. And then he looked to one side, and he walked out of sight toward my best friend's house. His name's John Jennings, and he lived in Dowsland. His parents are still there. And he walked down towards his house and towards a pathway leading to a gate in a field. And I ran down there. He was out of sight for a few moments, and when I ran down there, he had vanished. And so I walked off thinking, no, that was my imagination, that can't be real. So I because I was a hardcore atheist at the time, I couldn't admit that I'd seen him. But I went on to see him 3 other times. A couple of years later on, my mother was giving me a lift back from my grandmother's place in Roebuck near Plymouth. And she said to me that she had started to believe in God now, and she started to believe in Jesus. And my initial reaction was just to think, poor misguided woman, what's she on about? So I said to her, okay, tell me all about this then. And she started telling me that she had seen Peter since he died. And when she was telling me about her sightings, each one rang a little bell in my head, and I thought, my goodness, I've seen him doing that, and I've seen him in that place as well. Her sightings was in Littlewoods in Dowsland, opposite John Jennings' house, and he was standing at the side of the road with some people, with some young men, and as she approached in her car, he ran out in front of her car on the street, about 3 feet away from the car. And he ran down the pathway towards the field, towards the gate. And she was telling me these things, and I was freaking out. I couldn't really deal with what she was telling me. So I started saying, well, I've seen someone who looks just like Peter doing those things in those places. Does it mean anything? And she said, oh yes, you've seen that, have you? And I said, yes, I have. And I went back to my flat, and I started really freaking out, because I knew what I had seen, and I knew that she had seen him too, and I had to stop being an atheist at that point. So I called her back up and I said, okay, there appears to be a God, there appears to be an afterlife. So I became agnostic. And a few years after that, I was suffering from depression. I hadn't accepted Jesus yet. I was suffering from psychosis even. I don't know what it was. I didn't have any official diagnosis at the time. But I was in my mother's flat in Walton-on-Thames. By this time, she had moved to Walton, as had my grandmother. And I was in a really bad state in her flat. I was having a full-blown, really violent fantasy, and I was freaking out. And suddenly, I called out to God, and I said, God, I don't want to be this way anymore, please help. And suddenly I felt very, very calm, and I heard a voice in my head say, just sit down and relax. And so I sat down and relaxed. And sometime afterwards, I heard this voice again, and it very, very clearly said, do you accept Jesus Christ into your life? And I answered it and I said yes. And suddenly I felt something being pulled out of me, like this dark spirit, this demon. And this very real thing got taken out of me and it was sent running down the corridor. And that was, I know now, Jesus pulling a spirit, a demon out of me. And for the next 3 days, I was filled with absolute joy and in a state of pure ecstasy. And I remember sitting in my mother's flat, having this feeling of absolute joy washing over me for a long time, and I could feel things that I'd never felt before. So I went up to the church, St Mary's in Moulton-on-Thames, and I spoke to the curate and the priest there, Charles and Chris, and they told me that I had an experience with the Holy Spirit, and that was the point I accepted Jesus in my life. And from there, my life has never been the same. I've not had any more psychotic episodes. I don't drink anymore. I don't smoke. I don't take drugs anymore. And I'm a different person. And I'm a different person through Christ. Well, now I know that Jesus is real. Now I know that there is a God and there is an afterlife. I would say to people, start praying, accept Jesus into your life, and he will change your life. And when you do that, it's not going to make all your problems disappear. You'll still have problems, you'll still have bad things happen to you, but he will help you get through things, and he does change lives. Well, that's the demon represents mental health problems, and it's kind of embracing or gripping hold of the person in front. It has a hold of the person, and the person in front is obviously distressed. It's quite a simple notion, but I generally use demons to represent mental health problems. I don't think I'm ever going to be recognised as a great painter, no. In the future I may have collectors, I may have a little fan base, but I don't think I'm ever going to be recognised as a great artist.